Welcome back, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed the break. I wanted to thank my co-presenter, Catherine Carter, for that great session on the art of preserving and presenting history. I hope this session has inspired you to visit Blenheim, Chartwell, the American Civil War Museum, and the Wallace Collection. Exhibitions are certainly one way of taking history to a mass audience, but another is through television and the internet. Winston Churchill was always interested in harnessing the potential of new technology. In his lifetime, he embraced radio and film as forms of entertainment and methods of broadcasting far and wide, and lived to see the dawning of the television age, as well as the first computer prototypes at Bletchley Park. It is interesting to speculate that, had he been alive today, his multi-volume histories of the First and Second World Wars might have quickly become television series. Our next presenter has embraced the power and potential of television and the internet as tools to share remarkable episodes in history, especially with those who may not realize how relevant history can be to their daily lives. Dan Snow comes from a long line of historians, politicians, and presenters. His great-great-grandfather was David Lloyd George, British Prime Minister and Churchill's colleague. Since first appearing on the airwaves in 2002, Dan has become a go-to presenter for major historical documentaries, many of them on military history. As a master of the podcast and regular on the History Festival circuit, he's also the driving force behind History Hit TV, an online channel for history fans with whom we are delighted to be partnering today. Dan will be taking questions from the audience at the end of his talk, so if you're watching online, please use the online Q&A function to send us your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Ladies and gentlemen, Dan Snow.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I am David Lloyd George's great-grandson. He's my mum's dad. Cue lots of jokes about being descended from David Lloyd George. But, and really I'm in the enemy camp here because I often think that we have space in the public consciousness for one great example of every sort of a leader. You have sort of a scientist, a writer, a leader, a playwright, Shakespeare, for example. And I think people often ask me why Churchill looms so large in terms of wartime leaders in British history. And I think it's, because of his sort of gigantic presence in our history, the extraordinary nature of his contribution. He was everywhere. The whole of the 20th century has got his fingerprints all over them. His ability to write, to shape his own narrative. So he was brilliant at telling us what he wanted us to think about him. But also, I think it's a product of the fact that most people, unlike probably us in this room, certainly unlike me, don't have a huge amount of brain space to deal with various wartime prime ministers and secretaries of state. And whereas I'm sure many of us have got a sort of top 5, top 10 wartime prime ministers, we're thinking, well, I mean, William Pitt the older, actually a decent Secretary of State, not a great Prime Minister. Pitt the younger, probably better. Palmerston, maybe Lloyd George. Most people just go, okay, Churchill, and he obscures the rest. It's sort of an eclipse, in the same way that Nelson may eclipse other 18th century admirals, tragically, because actually, well, let's not get into 18th century admirals, but anyway, there were, and for example, you know, a Montgomery or a Wellington can obscure British generals further back. So I do think when I ponder why everyone today has forgotten my ancestor, for many people in this room's far more famous ancestor, even though Lloyd George made an extraordinary contribution to the greatest war at that point Britain ever fought. He also shaped the world in the Versailles Treaty, the Paris treaties that followed the war and the other treaties. And yet he's largely forgotten today. And I like to explore why that is. Now that was an unintended introduction, just made me think because of your kind introduction. It reminded me of my ancestor. And I think that is it does lead me to talk about making history because it's the way in which we make history, the way in which we broadcast history, the way in which we write history, listen to history now, watch it online, watch it on TikToks. Is, of course, how we shape the popular imagination, the popular concept of history itself. What is remembered, what is forgotten? I had a very strange childhood. I had a very traditional childhood, really. I grew up in the 1980s, rather eccentrically, reading books in my grandma's house, G.A. Henty books, some daring-do 19th century imperial then heroes, now often regarded in a different way. And so I had this I think unusually for my generation, I was plugged in. I had access to these kind of remarkable, these episodes in British history that school children 2 or 3 generations above me would have been so familiar with. General Wolfe climbing the heights of Abraham. And these are stories that influenced Churchill himself. We know that. He was fascinated by it in the late 19th century. Clive of India, Wolfe of Quebec. These heroes, these men usually that had played these, like Francis Drake, these extraordinary parts in this kind of quite Whiggish version of history, a version of history that saw a kind of English-British story as going from a peripheral European state to kind of a global hegemon, thanks in part to the daring do, to the brilliant exploits of these individuals, celebrated in these books, celebrated in the culture, and interestingly, largely forgotten now, remarkably. I bet you most people, if they have heard about them now, would hear about them purely in a kind of negative sense, arguments around statues or unfortunate involvement with things like the trade in enslaved Africans of the 17th and 18th centuries. So making history is what every generation does. We're constantly in dialogue with our history. We're choosing bits to remember. We're choosing characters to focus on. We're, of course, doing that very obviously in schools where a curriculum is set, where we are partly, in universities, we're perhaps slightly more responding to what students are asking for. I understand that my history course at Oxford that I went on, when I was there, it was still very interested in the great European empires. Now, it's very few people study that. The young students want to study Ottoman Turkey. They're fascinated by Chinese history, fascinated by the trans-Eurasian links that you see with the development of a great Mongol empire, for example, the caliphates of the late antique and medieval periods. Those things are what students want to study. And so I've seen that in my career because I have quite a direct connection with what the audience wants, in that nowadays with the internet, you know about everything. I know exactly what does well and what doesn't do well. I get daily updates. I'm now besieged. There's now an avalanche of statistics that I wake up to every morning. I have to sleep with my phone downstairs, or I wake up at 5 in the morning to check which posts about Churchill have done well, or which, and so I actually am now receiving. I've got quite a lot of data about what people are interested in and where they're interested in and what age they are and what gender they are and all that kind of stuff. And my career began in a very different way. It began in a way that was, until that point, considered very normal. Television was a very dominant medium. There were only 4 or 5 channels in most households in the UK when I began on television, very early part of this century. And it was very straightforward. There'd be someone at the BBC who would go, well, I'm very interested in X. Find me someone to make a program about that. And so you get a phone call, hallelujah, very exciting, you get a phone call about that, and you go and work on it. And it was always very awkward because I would get these calls, wonderful moments, like Chartwell or an archive ringing me up saying, very exciting, we just discovered this, or we just opened this new exhibition, doing this. Do you think you can do a program on it? Because, of course, on TV, I look like sort of all-conquering, like, it's all in my gift. And I'd go, yeah, I'll see what I can do. And I'd go to the BBC, I'd beat a trail to the top floor, the 6th floor. I'd say, look, it's really interesting. Chartwell have just, uncovered this thing about Churchill. And they'd look at me like I was something the cat had dragged in. And it was very difficult to get history commissioned. It was a massive struggle. In the same way, you might be able to, there were other gatekeepers. You might go to the Telegraph and see if you get a feature written there, Daily Mail, or perhaps Radio 4. But there were far fewer. But the internet had happened, was a thing that had happened. And I'm not claiming that I was some young millennial digital native, but I was young enough to know the internet was happening and my friends were looking at things on the internet. And so I was in my early 20s thinking, this feels a bit odd. We're making these BBC programs. At the Battle of Hastings, for example, the anniversary coming up next week, we'd make a program at Hastings. We'd take 6 months to make the program. It would go on television once, and then it would never be seen again, unless it might be repeated, and it may, years later, be released on VHS or DVD or something like that for people to buy. And my program, actually, on Hastings, I'm slightly scarred by this, it went out on Friday night at 9 o'clock, really good slot to get young people interested in history when they're like, Dan, hey, Dan's young. The young people might watch this show. And I'm like, well, let's hope so. My goodness, that'd be great, wouldn't it? 9 o'clock Friday night. That's when all the 20-somethings are going to be at home watching history. Anyway, and this particular 9 o'clock Friday night was also the opening ceremony of the Athens Olympic Games in August. I mean, you couldn't make it up. And so the following day, I walked past the newsagent and saw a headline in a newspaper going, Athens Olympic ceremony, largest television event in the history of the world. And I was like, anyone know what was on BBC Two when that was going on? Horrific. And that's we've all got these sob stories, folks. But that's the wonderful way in which Churchill's life sums up so brilliantly, these wonderful moments of opportunity and luck and failure and disaster. And that, my friends, was a catastrophic failure, I have to say. But it was one that like Churchill, I heeded Churchill's advice. I kept going. Just keep, and that, I think Churchill, of the many of his many quotes that we're so fond of sharing and talking about and thinking about, I think his advice on just bloody-minded obstinacy is something that has spoken very true in my life. As you crash from failure and disappointment to failure and disappointment, you make this beautiful program. You make history on the Battle of Hastings. Absolutely nobody watches it at all. And you then have to sort of square your shoulders and walk into that next meeting and say, next time, I'm going to deliver. And you see Churchill again and again doing that through his career. Buffeted by factors outside his control, and yet always, and yet bringing those remarkable strengths, skills, foibles, eccentricities that we all have, and eventually, of course, the circumstances will fit, and we will all, I hope, have our summer of 1940 at some stage in our lives. I'm still waiting, personally. But and so then I realized, but I was doing this program at Hastings. Let's take the Hastings example. I thought to myself, I don't think I've made this history program. I'm not sure. This is why it's going out once. The place you want to see this program is actually on the field of Hastings. You want to go down there, and people have got these things in their pockets now, called these like phones. They've got little videos, some of these phones, and you want to be in position and go, hang on, okay, well, that's what, oh, right, okay, the Normans came up here, Shield Wall was here, the Bretons, if you believe Norman propaganda, the Bretons flowed down the hill there, Harold's men followed them, was it a fake retreat, was it not, who knows, they were cut down, two brothers, the place that you want to really interact with that, not sitting on your sofa on a Friday night, 9 o'clock, is actually possibly on the battlefield. And wouldn't it be fun to try and transport this material to the battlefield? In the same way, once the internet enabled, wouldn't it be fun to try to reach out to people, bypass these broadcasters? The BBC, the other thing you'd do is you'd make a history program, you'd send it in to Nat Geo or the BBC or Sky or whoever you're working for, and someone in the building would decide it was a bit boring, and they thought Montgomery was more interesting than General Slim or something. General Slim would go. There we go. So there we go. So famously, Sheila Hancock once was on a program that I was on and asked the editor she didn't think the clash in North Atlantic against Bismarck was particularly important, so she asked Sheila Hancock, who was in the green room. I have no idea why. She said, I think that script slightly overstates the importance of the Bismarck clash in 1941. And so I got this script back through, and someone said, well, Sheila Hancock decided it was. I was like, have I gone mad? So the great thing was, so rather than this great bureaucracy churning out these programs, what the last 15, 20 years have showed is that people all around the world, the kids these days, they love watching this YouTube and they're watching videos on Facebook. The downside, folks, of having no gatekeepers is you get lots of mad anti-vax propaganda and all this kind of madness. And you get sort of, genocides in Myanmar, which is obviously shocking. It's obviously we're coming to terms with how to deal with this monster we've created. But the upside of it is that we are able, someone like me or anyone in this room is able to start just broadcasting, go along to the Churchill archives, choose the 10 most extraordinary documents, and start just broadcasting that. And you will find an audience that are interested in that. It turns out that we were too timid about what the audience are interested in. And I was going around going, I think, this wonderful opportunity has presented itself. There's a Spitfire buried in a bog in Donegal. And he goes to people, and because it's a bog, it's in anaerobic conditions. This Spitfire is one of the best preserved flown by an American who got in deep trouble with the Americans for volunteering to fly with the RAF before the Americans entered the war. He's called Bud Wolfe. He had engine failure coming back over Donegal. He just failed to make it to Northern Ireland. He crashed in Donegal. He bailed out, his boots got ripped off, he landed barefoot in Donegal on a Sunday afternoon, and his plane plopped into a bog. It was so boggy they couldn't recover it. So it was all down there, anaerobic conditions. I was assured by the aircraft archaeologists it would be the best Spitfire ever recovered from the war, albeit one that had been involved, it crashed into the ground terminal velocity, so I mean it wasn't ready to fly, but it would be incredibly well preserved. I went to BBC, and you would not believe the effort that was required to convince the BBC to make this programme. And in the end, it was a 10-minute sequence of another programme about various other things. And there was not a confidence there, because, to be fair, broadcasters have a very wide remit. There are many people, bizarrely, to whom a perfectly preserved Spitfire wreck in a bog in Donegal from 1941 is not ideal evening viewing. I've never met them, but there are people out there apparently who feel like that. And so we sort of got it into a programme. We went and dug it up. And it became a kind of global media moment, because obviously it was very exciting. It was actually a great fun story. I'll quickly, this is off message, but anyway, Bud Wolfe got interned by the Irish, sent to Dublin, because Ireland's a neutral state, sent to Dublin, to the Curragh camp, which was a former British Army camp outside Dublin, where he was interned with loads of Italians, Norwegians, seafarers, usually in shipwrecks, rescued, washed up in Ireland, a couple of airmen, people who ended up in Ireland, all combatant nations were interned. They had a lovely time. The Italians, Germans played football against the Brits. They were going to survive the war, stepping out with local ladies, having a lovely war. Bud Wolfe, though, it wasn't for him, so he escaped. And by escaped, I mean he opened a small picket gate in front of his rather nice Nissen hut, got on a tram to Dublin and took a train to Belfast. At which point, amazingly, the British military authorities sent him back to Dublin, which tells you how bad the war was going in 1941. They did not want to risk upsetting the Irish. They wanted to just go, look, Ireland's neutral. We need to respect that. The last thing we need is any suggestion that push Ireland any further towards the Axis powers in 1941. And so he was sent, to his absolute horror, he was sent back to Dublin. America entered the war, and the USA was then slightly more robust about getting its people out of Dublin. He ended up flying for the US Air Force for the rest of the war, and in fact in Korea, and I think in Vietnam as well. Extraordinary, amazing character. So anyway, we dug up this aircraft, and Twitter was in its infancy, so I'd put the odd picture on. And we had suddenly the sort of Sydney Morning Herald was getting in touch, and ringing us up saying, can we have a picture of this? And we had this sort of moment, but of course I had a rusty old mobile phone. We were trying to run this international media event from this field in Donegal with a phone and one bar of signal. And then we sort of went to BBC and said, look, we got this amazing thing, and they were like, I mean, great. And it went, and they then edited it, and it, well, we'll broadcast it at some stage in the future. A year later, it goes out, and they change the title of the program. So everyone, and to this day, everyone goes, whatever happened to that Spitfire thing that you were doing? I was like, no, it actually went in a program called Northern Ireland's War or something. Rather than the amazing story of the Spitfire that came out of the bog, it went into a separate program. And so on that day, I said to myself, this is madness. And so I decided I was going to make. It's so arrogant to say making history. I'm obviously not making history in a kind of Churchillian sense, but I'm sort of shaping how history is broadcast. And so I said, I am going to take advantage of this extraordinary revolution that we're going through. I am going to go and film things, not for the general audience of Discovery Channel and Nat Geo, and where the great panic is. I've been in these meetings where you're panicking all the time that someone's going to turn it off because they're just bored. I'm going to go and make programs for people that absolutely bloody love history, because I'm convinced enough of them out there. Look at the data. More people go to history and heritage sites every weekend, museums, galleries, battlefields. More people go every weekend than they go to football matches. We are told, I am told, consider history is a bit of a niche, isn't it? I go, well, it might be a niche. It's a fairly big niche. If you look at publishing, go to a bookshop, history books bulging off the bestseller lists. You look at movies, great history movies all over the place. I mean, Game of Thrones is history adjacent. But, TV show, everyone does these huge new TV shows being commissioned about great moments of history. And it turns out that history has a giant following. When you trust the audience, when you realize you take advantage of the internet, you go, well, actually, maybe maybe it doesn't have a sort of, maybe there's enough people around the world that collectively do have a big audience, and that's what we did. So I have a podcast now that goes out to over 1 million people a week, in which we revel in being history geeks. The more detailed and geeky, the better. We want to discuss ship design in the 17th century, how the change from clinker-built ships to Carvel-built ships allowed European ships, Portuguese and English, to sail further than before, survive greater storms in the North Atlantic, etc. That's what I'm talking about. So my career has completely inverted since I started. And so the internet, for all the negativity we all hear about it, and I share that, and as you know, particularly with young children, all the concerns that we all have. But at its best, it's the most extraordinary way of communicating, in my case, history, with a gigantic global audience who are obsessed with it. I mean, I've got to the point now where I have a TV channel, it's called History Hit. It's basically like a Netflix for history, just history documentaries, and you can watch it around the world and subscribe. Our most watched program at the moment is a German war diary from the Second World War, Operation Barbarossa, which I'll be honest, I watched it and thought, this is pretty heavy going. It turns out it's our most watched program ever. So there's an audience out there that feel they're underserved, who are desperate to access history. They have, and when I meet them in the flesh, I'm very impressed. They are people from all walks of life. They often haven't been lucky enough to study at great universities. They are desperate to engage with primary sources. They're desperate to hear from academics. They're desperate to hear nuance. They're desperate to get into a debate, to move beyond the kind of clean-cut précis of things, to hear complexity. And I'm relearning almost everything that I learned at the start of my career, which was you're doing a history program, but everyone thinks it's a bit boring. Just try and make it as lively as you can. That was the sense of what I was sort of told when I started out making history. And now there is an embrace of super fans. And so the future for history is very bright. The future for people like us in this room who are fascinated by, I mean, you're clearly fascinated by Churchill, but I suspect that your interest in history doesn't stop there. We can all now access that in completely different ways. And so, for example, I went to Blenheim the other day. We took a walk round the Churchill connections at Blenheim. Sorry, well, there's plenty of Churchill connections in Blenheim. We worked at Winston's connection with Blenheim. There's slightly interesting timing of his birth and whether he was premature or something else had been going on. So, for example, we were able to explore that with the curators there. We were able to go into enormous depth. We were able to talk about the history of that house. But we were also able, while we were there, to make completely different programs. We killed two birds with one stone about the first Duke, about the building of Blenheim, about that extraordinary story. And so because there is no upper limit, the great thing is I feel I've got a connection now with this global audience who love history. And the only sense check is, do I think this is interesting? If I think it's interesting, I'm confident that my fellow travelers around the world are going to think it's interesting too. And so what is also fascinating is we've definitely discovered quite a lot. I mentioned I have this avalanche of data now. We're discovering things that were thought not to be true. We're discovering that actually people's interest in history stretches way beyond the Second World War. There was a perception in schools, for example, at GCSE level here in the UK, which is a kind of high school-ish leaving certificate. There was a perception, actually, the 20th century history, the Nazis, Stalin, Second World War, was really all that people were interested in. There's a sense of that in the publishing trade. And actually, we've discovered that that's not true at all. The medieval period for us, it does better than the Second World War. It does, which I'm very surprised about. Particularly surprised in the visual format, because Second World War, you've actually got moving archive. You've got the voices of these people. You've got Churchill's astonishing broadcasts, albeit they were recorded slightly later after the war, many of them. But you've got maybe the most famous ones. But so I've always assumed that 20th century history would predominate. It would be because it's more accessible. It's so fascinating. I mean, let's take the summer of 1940. Let's take May 1940. The fact that you can go to Downing Street, you can go to the war rooms, you can look at minutes of these meetings, you can look at Jock Colville's report, you can see moving images of what was going on. For me, that's so compelling, what extraordinary thing that is. You can interview people that were there. And yet, to our audience, History Hits audience, they seem to find just as compelling is accounts of which we lack sources. We have a catastrophic lack of sources for much of the Middle Ages, well, certainly compared to the 20th century. We don't have the access to those things, and yet that is still something that people find incredibly compelling, incredibly exciting. So it's good news for those of us that love history in the roundest sense. I guess I'd say one thing before I ask for questions, because I'd like you to know where you'd like me to go, really. But the final thing is actually on this issue of primary testimony. I was talking to some of the organisers outside earlier. I understand lots of you last night met a wonderful Bomber Command veteran. And one of the great joys of my job is interviewing and preserving. So to come to the final aspect of making history, if I have made history, the thing I'm proudest of is creating a mini archive of extraordinary people telling their story on camera. And I've been lucky enough now to interview hundreds of Second World War veterans, Vietnam veterans. I've interviewed women, survivors of genocide in Rwanda and Congo who've shared some of their experiences with me. And I can say that's the sort of most satisfying, most remarkable thing that I've been able to do. Particularly, you realize the importance of it as I get older, and some of the people I was able to interview when I was younger are no longer with us. And you realize the moment they pass away, you realize there's that extraordinary break, and you find yourself thinking, as we all do, why didn't I interview my grandpa in more detail? Like we all maybe had a little bit of video or a little bit of audio. I wish I'd sat down with him and asked about the Battle of the Atlantic. And so there's that absolute discontinuity when we lose a member of that generation, or any generation, of course. And so I am so fascinated by the idea that we still don't know where this mad journey ends. It's too early to say, the famous Chinese expression about the French Revolution. It's too soon to tell. About 120 years ago or so, a bit more, they invented a way of preserving voice, and then shortly after, moving images of people. And as a result, we are coming to something like, will our children, will our grandchildren have a more real connection with the First World War, for example, than we do with the Battle of Waterloo? You know, the intensity of the Napoleonic War, the loss of Napoleon's gigantic army in Russia, is almost as awful, but in different ways, as awful as anything that happened on the battlefields of the Western Front. And yet, to us, few of us can get really emotional about it, I think, now. Oil paintings and flowery descriptions of that winter retreat only really get the juices flowing for those who truly immerse themselves in it. And what I'm fascinated by is this revolution that's gone on with first capturing images and voice, secondly, the fact we can now digitize it and access it any time. So school kids go, oh, do you want to hear what Harry Patch experienced in Passchendaele today? Boom, press go, and suddenly in a classroom you listen to Harry Patch talking about being wounded at Passchendaele. It's that simple. And I wonder whether, I still don't know, whether those historical events will fade, just as Waterloo and the retreat from Moscow faded, or whether this is the start of a very new way of interacting with our history. If we had Lloyd George's, coming back to where I started, absolutely barnstorming speech on the outbreak of war, ladies and gentlemen, right up there with the great wartime oratory of certain other prime ministers, if we had that, which we don't have, would we find that as compelling as Churchill's extraordinary speech in 1940? If we had Chatham's speech in the House of Lords, where he begged the government not to antagonize the American colonists, the rebels in America, and collapsed in the House of Lords, if we had that speech, if we had moving images of that speech, would that history seem more vivid to us? And the answer is, we don't know yet. We're involved in the most remarkable experiment, like so much of human history, like our contemporary world. We are involved, we started something, and we have no idea where it finishes. So it comes back to this idea of preserving the past, and of disseminating that to a global population at the click of a button. And so it's a very, very exciting time to be making history. Thank you very much. If you've got any questions like that, oh, sorry, yes, here we go. Get our MC back on the stage.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was truly inspirational and a great taster for History Hit TV, which I have enjoyed immensely over the last few years. So thank you so much for all of your wonderful productions. And I especially appreciated your nod to G.A. Henty right now. I've read a fair few of those myself while doing research for my senior thesis about British prisoner of war escape narratives and their origins in some early Victorian adventure fiction. So thank you very much. So we are going to now open it up for questions. So as ever, please wait for the microphone to reach you. And we'll also take questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A function for those of you online. And I might start here with a moderator's prerogative and ask you a question. We live in a world right now where STEM is obviously incredibly important, where there are urgent solutions that people need that come from the STEM fields, not least to respond to COVID. How do you convince people that history is similarly urgent and something that we need to talk about and to explore when there are much, it seems to people, more urgent needs to study other fields?
Right, you've triggered me. You've triggered me. I, of course, I'm the first person. STEM, clearly amazingly important, but we do damn the humanities to our detriment. And I have been really struck recently with a few scholars and books that I've talked to. We had a huge book by Mary Fulbrook on the Holocaust. We had a huge important work by Richard Overy on the outbreak of the Second World War in its truly global sense, and how actually the roots of the Second World War go through the First War right back to the age of imperialism in the late 19th century. And what has been so compelling about these books in particular, and these conversations I've had with the people, is the importance of ideas. We are not the product of these amazing machines that we're inventing. We're not, our behaviors and our political views are not simply being shaped in a kind of Marxist way by this big economic story that we're all being swept up in. I think it's easy to think we are. We think and act the way we do because of ideas, because of the things that we are told, the music that we're listening to, the movies that we're watching, the speeches given. Yes, we do sometimes still listen to politicians. And I've been so struck by Richard Overy, for example, because he thinks basically the Second World War happened because of evangelists for empire, who said, look, it's a really good idea that we conquer. It did not necessarily happen because obviously there is an economic motive, and there is the desire to acquire natural resources but actually he identifies the poets, the writers, the spin doctors for empire, and Mary does the same with the Holocaust. And so that's one reason why we need to keep an eye on our culture. And the people that are setting that narrative, bless them, are not the wonderful scientists who are producing vaccines, but it's the boisterous, noisy, talkative, brilliant, right? It's the Churchills around the world, the scholars and the artists and the thinkers, and that's hugely important. Secondly, although I love STEM, again, the work that Mary's doing to talk about the past. If you go into detail, she talks about how we came to murder millions and millions of our fellow citizens in the lifetime of my own father, in the very recent history of this continent, why we chose to, not all of us, but many of us in Europe, too many of us, went along with a project to murder millions and millions of people. And it was the ideas that got us there, but she is taking names. she is creating a template, she's creating an archive that we can go to, and where we are writing down those mistakes, and maybe we might just pay attention to it and read those things and be less likely to do things like that in the future. And lastly, the reason we should pay attention, I've got several other reasons. One is because humanity is also fun, they make us laugh, and they're good for us. And if you look at what Steve Jobs studied at university, it wasn't IT. If you look at what the great creators, many of the great visionaries, what they go to, they're not all just doing management, nothing wrong with management courses, but they're doing courses on calligraphy. They're sitting around reading books about Eastern philosophy. They're sitting around reading about Winston Churchill. So it's good for us, and we shouldn't be ashamed of that. It's great that we can do both. We can chew gum and we can walk at the same time. And lastly, there is a fake news pandemic in the world at the moment. People do not believe things. People do not understand where to go for reliable facts. And what historians do is provide facts, often inconvenient, often contradictory, but they provide facts. And if people go, we've got this major problem about fake news. I don't know what we do. Should we have a course at school called media literacy? I go, you could do that, or you could do a course at school which analyzes sources and teaches you to be suspicious of things that you're told, to weigh up the bias of people that are writing or making programs or podcasts or telling you things, to analyze things that have happened in the past. Now there might be different accounts of how they came to be. You could just reinvest into that subject, and that subject's called history. Giving people a historical mindset is allowing them to analyze information that are given in a mature way. And so I believe that history also, study of history, study of humanities, could inoculate us against the pandemic of fake news that we're facing. Sorry to go on about that.
Very well said. Thank you. All right, we have a question. Do you have the microphone?
This is quite related, actually, to what you were just saying. But to start off with, I'm a big fan of your documentaries and things. But a few days ago, I came across a tweet that you did last year. I work at Policy Exchange on the History Matters unit, and you wrote about it. How can any historian sign up to this inchoate shambles? Are they suggesting that if, in the course of archival research, they find out something that runs counter to a popular version of history, they will self-censor? And just in reply to that question, that's not at all what we're saying. It's more, just to set the record straight, it's about when history is presented in an incorrect way, in a non-factual way, that's something that needs to be rectified. And just to give an example, earlier this year I was very lucky to co-author with Andrew Roberts a response to Churchill College's it wasn't just critical, it was very historically inaccurate in so many places, and we just went through and provided a very objective analysis of that. And so we don't argue that history shouldn't be critically analysed, but wouldn't you agree that historians have an important role to play in actually setting the record straight when there are very clear when it's clearly going against what actually happened and when things aren't being factually represented?
Brilliant. Good. I agree. That's good. I think that's what we're all here to do. I suspect the internet, the nature of the internet, it just finds gaps and then drives great wedges through those gaps and makes everyone very angry at each other. But no, we're on the same team. That's the plan. Anything else?
Yes, we have a question from online.
Yeah, excuse me, one moment. Multitasking over here, so give me 1 second. So this question is from Josh Greenberg, and this is for you, Dan. Thank you. He says, how do you keep the message of Churchill relevant and of interest to students of today in light of, quote, woke culture prevalent on college campuses, both in the US and UK?
Well, I'm not on any college campuses, so I'm always very bad. I don't really, I don't know about the prevailing atmosphere on college campuses, but what I do, clearly Churchill's, how do you keep him relevant? Obviously, he's relevant. Churchill, his finger, his whether it's the modern Middle East, whether it's the modern world, whether it's the writing of history itself, he's an astonishingly important figure to know about. I think maybe the thing we need to keep. I get confused with the Church thing is, are you kind of? Is it a celebrate? Is it a celebrate? Is it a putting? It's like erecting statues. Is it are you looking for heroes, or are you studying the man, the career, the work? And it seems to me it's very easy to do, but there's that latter. It's also very easy to find heroic. His almost unique and clear-eyed understanding of the situation in the spring and summer of 1940 was deeply heroic. It's easy to find. David Lloyd George, sorry to come back, but who was a deeply flawed individual, like in every way. His upbringing, the way he's self-taught, the first person from a working class background to become Prime Minister of Britain, that has elements of heroic. That's a remarkable, inspiring story. I find it very easy to be able to find aspects of any character or life journey inspiring and interesting without having to suddenly go, but I'm now going to put this person on my mantelpiece and sort of do it, like subscribe to all their views on every single thing that they did. I find the whole debate so confusing, really. Clearly, you need to study Churchill. And I hope people saw. I actually don't know. I keep reading on Twitter that everyone, but I don't know if people saw. But I can't imagine they're not, because studying the mid-20th century. If you're not studying Churchill, what are you doing? I mean, yeah.
We have a question on this side.
All right. We clearly need to introduce Dan to our journal, Finest Hour, because this is the current issue, and he will recognize, I think, the portrait of the gentleman on the table of contents page.
Oh, goodness me. Yep. There we go.
As it is David Lloyd George, and there's a feature article in there by a Lloyd George biographer, and the lead article is written by Kenneth O. Morgan, who did all of the entries about the Lloyd Georges in the Dictionary of National Biography. So we're not ignoring your family.
I'm sure not. This has turned into a huge. I'd never talk about David Lloyd George. It's very embarrassing. I think you triggered me earlier. But his relationship with Churchill is so fascinating, isn't it? I find that one of the great relationships of British political history.
Well, I think we might close out with one question about history as it relates to the future. So I often am asked about and think about, just in my day-to-day life, about how we're going to tell the stories of this time and future times as historians of the future. And I think people often feel very concerned that because we don't write letters, we don't write diaries to the extent that we used to, that we might not be able to tell history the way that we do now. However, what you were saying about the popularity of programs like the ancient and history of the Middle Ages and the medieval period, and how fascinating that is to people, and the different tools that you use to tell it when you don't have kind of live recordings of people speaking and film footage, and yet you're able to provide such rich documentary evidence and tell those stories. So thinking about the popularity of that content and the tools that you use to make those sorts of programs compared to the types of the sources that we think about in the 19th, 20th, and 21st century, how do you think about how we'll tell the stories from history of this time in the future going forward?
Well, I don't know, because of course we don't know. Are we living in a digital dark age? Are we going to lose everything? You know, if the Google server goes down in Iceland, have I lost all my children's photos and passed it? I mean, I don't know. It's a bizarre and worrying answer. Although I don't think there's much in my overflowing inbox of any particular interest of some future historians. But I do, so I don't know the answer to that. We have a problem, don't we, of too much information now. I've got 30,000 pictures of me poncing about on my iPhone. I mean, that's too many for, it's more pictures than we have of and that's just one person. So I also think what's interesting as you're saying that, I'm so struck by, so we mentioned Wolfe. Churchill was obsessed with Wolfe. Now no one's heard of General Wolfe. The present finds people to be interested by in our past. The story of Shackleton, for example, is a very interesting one. Shackleton came back in the First World War. First War was raging. He'd done this remarkable journey of survival, effectively. No one paid any attention to him at the time, and actually he was rather an obscure figure. And then he was revived. He was like plucked. He was found. In the same way that we might have heard of a certain Secretary of the Treasury in the United States at the moment, who is, I believe, the subject of a popular musical. So, Alexander Hamilton, no one cared about him 5 years ago. And now my kids know all about his career, like it's bonkers. So I do know that what the future finds interesting about the present is not what we think it will be. And I suspect, I don't know, but I'll take a guess, they are going to, if we see how climate breakdown goes, they will be very interested in the people working, who probably no one in this room has heard of, who are trying to mitigate that, or working on fuel cells, or working on solar panels, in the same way that we have just come into contact with these people working on these amazing new vaccines that we didn't even know existed 6 months ago, but who are now global figures. So I think the future, what they will do, goodness knows what they're going to use, what they will do is we cannot know today what bits of our present they're going to find important. Trump and Boris may be footnotes. They may be far more interested in engineers, scientists, cultural figures, or some character among us like an Oliver Cromwell, who is so anonymous until he emerges or he or she emerges as great despot who we're yet to even know about. So we don't know.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but thank you so much, Dan, and all of the audience for your questions.